Well, we come now in our second study to the accession of King Asa and his first 10 years, which are a remarkable demonstration of faith. And this was, of course, the divine blessing given to him. The peace was given because of his faith and his determination to overthrow the idolatry that was in Judah. And we saw in our first study earlier today that there was a great need for a reformer in Judah, and Asa was their first reformer. And we're going to see just how great his reformation was in our subsequent considerations. So we're in 2 Chronicles chapter 14, and we read there in verse 1, "So Abijah slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and Asa his son reigned in his stead." And then it says in the final sentence of that verse, "In his days the land was quiet 10 years. So the aggressive and the blindly hypocritical Abijah, who we considered in our first session, died with Judah in a parlous spiritual state. Reform was needed in this nation, God's ecclesia. And so Asa comes on the scene. His name, as we saw, is physician, and he turned out to be truly a spiritual physician. So there's a deliberate contrast drawn here between Asa and his father Abijah. They were very different men. Abijah, as we saw, was belligerent, while Asa was a man of peace. And God gave him peace as a reward for his uprightness and predisposition towards building up the ecclesia. And we're going to see that when we get to verse 6, because it tells us precisely that at verse 6. For it says, the land had rest, and he had no war in those years, because Yahweh had given him rest. So there was the reward given to this man for his faithfulness and his uprightness. And we're going to see exactly what he does, and it's not an easy job that he undertook. In verse 2 of 2 Chronicles 14, he goes on to say that he did that which was good and right in the eyes of Yahweh his God. Now it's very important to recognise why the Spirit puts there the word eyes. And a little note alongside verse 2 to chapter 16 and verse 9 is very helpful. In our studies tomorrow, God willing, we'll get to chapter 16 and we'll read in verse 9, "For the eyes of Yahweh run to and fro through the earth to show himself strong in the behalf of those whose heart is safe toward him." Okay? So there is the key reason why you have reference made in verse 2 of chapter 14 to doing right in the eyes of Yahweh. And of course the lesson to us is very simple, isn't it? You don't need to be Einstein to work that one out. That we don't go anywhere, we don't think anything that's not known by our God, nor seen by his messengers. Because one was ascribed to us at the time of our baptism, appointed as an heir, as one of those who administer the heirs of salvation. So he's got your number, all right? He's got your name, and he's got your record. So there's nothing that we do that's not in the eyes of Yahweh. So that's the lesson, the simple lesson that comes out of verse 2. In verse 3 of chapter 14, we read, "For he took away the altars of the strange gods and the high places, and brake down the images and cut down the groves." There's an array of things that he does here. And Rotherham says for that phrase there, he took away the altars of the strange gods, that he took away the foreign altars. Now, of course, we know that Solomon had built some of these foreign altars, and they were on the Mount of Olives. And of course, the high places come up over and over again in the record of Kings and Chronicles. They were a bane to Israel's spiritual life, right through the record of the kings. Now, in fact, when you go back to the companion account of 1 Kings 15 and verse 14, it says the high places were not removed out of the land. That's repeated in 2 Chronicles 15 and verse 17. So it seems he removed the high places out of the cities of Judah. That probably is what verse 5 is about. See verse 5 here of chapter 14. Also, he took away out of all the cities of Judah the high places and the images and so on. Okay, but he only curtailed activity at those in the rest of the land. It was left to Hezekiah, much later, of course, to actually remove the high places from the land. And of course, he was followed ultimately by Josiah, who did a very thorough job of removing the high places. So, you just got to try and reconcile those two accounts, and it seems as though this is a reference here to the cities and the removal of them from the places where people congregated, rather than right through the whole land. He broke down the images and cut down the groves. Now the two words there, the word image, it obviously has that idea of an image. It's the word matsibar, a column or an idol. And the word groves, asherim, is a reference to standing idols. And asherim, of course, as nearly always in all of these false worship of these false gods, there was fertility rites. It always had a sexual connotation. That being, of course, the bias in human nature, isn't it? And look at our world today. What's the bias of our world today? You know, it's all about that, isn't it? It dominates human society. And it wasn't any different in those days. If you turn away to false gods, that's the way you worship them. It was gross in the use of carnal imagery, just like the world today. Then we have verse 4. Now, verse 4 is very interesting, and it's very important because this is the first stage of Asa's reformation. And he sees the need to do something which ultimately is not the successful way to do it. But you've got to start somewhere. It's a bit like raising children. Unless you apply disciplines when they're young, then they're not going to listen to you a little bit later on. Okay, and that's the way it works. And so he has to apply discipline, so he commands them. You know, commanding someone to do something which they maybe don't want to do is not the greatest way to go. But that's where you've got to start, and he knew that. He was wise enough to know that he had to lay down the law. He commanded Judah to seek Yahweh. So with the idols removed from the land, he proceeded to substitute good for evil. Now, the principle there is one that really should govern our whole life. It's Romans 12, verse 21. I think this is one of the most important verses in the whole Bible, actually. Romans 12:21 says, "Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." Now that applies in your personal life. If you have a particular problem in life, this comes out of Ephesians chapter 4, by the way, it's the principle of Ephesians 4. If you've got a particular problem in life, don't focus on the problem so much. Focus on doing something different that's good, you know, and wholesome. And guess what happens? You tend to forget about the problem. It recedes into the background because you're so focused on doing something positive and good. Now, this works not only in your individual life, it works in ecclesias, it works in families. All right? If you've got a problem in the family, get the family focused on something that's good and wholesome and high and lofty. And the problem recedes into the background. So it's a very important principle. He understood that principle. So he starts to introduce good in order that the evil might be forgotten and left behind. So wonderful little example there. So he knew, however, the danger of leaving a vacuum. Now we know the story of Luke chapter 11, the man who sweeps out his house, you know, and then 7 worse spirits come along. You must not leave vacuums. You know, if you've got a problem and you say, well, I must not do that, I must not do that, and all you're doing is, you know, saying, well, I'm going to stay away, and you don't put something good in its place, you've got a vacuum. And that's not going to have a good outcome. That's the principle he's using here. At this early stage, though it was necessary to command Judah to seek, that word seek, by the way, darash means to tread or to frequent, to follow their God, he knew that this had to be the first stage of the process because of the long period prior to that where there was all this laxity and just rampant idolatry. I mean, there were even sodomites in the land in the days of Rehoboam. You believe that? In the ecclesia? Yeah. There were sodomites in the land. So this was really a tough situation for him to handle. And this is the way he went about it. Now, did God approve of this? Well, we know he approved it. You know why? He gave him peace. He gave him peace for 10 years so he could get on with the job. So it's wonderful, isn't it? By the way, that reference to sodomites is in 1 Kings 15, verse 12, as you can see on the screen. Now, the ritual prostitutes were introduced in the days of Rehoboam to serve as priests in the high places. 1 Kings 14:24 tells you that. What an awful thing that is. How gross that is. However, it's not any much different nowadays. We just came past, we weren't that far away from Tel Aviv, which is the capital of homosexuality in Europe, not Israel, in Europe. Okay, you know, so it's with us again today. And by the way, You know what God calls his ecclesia in the days of Isaiah, in Isaiah 1? He says, "Here, Sodom and Gomorrah." That's what he thought of the ecclesia in the days of Isaiah. So I wonder what he would say about our community today when we have the same problem in our midst. Well, so we've got to be aware of what's going on. And this man was aware of it, and he got stuck into it. There was no compromise with Asa. He got in there to get rid of these things. And he had to do this. Have a look at verse 13 of, I think this must be 1 Kings 15. So come back to 1 Kings 15 and verse 13. Now, we passed by this a little bit, I think, this morning. So 1 Kings 15 and verse 13 says, "And also Maacah," and this is his grandmother, remember? His mother, it should be grandmother, "even her he removed from being queen because she had made an idol in a grove. And Asa destroyed her idol and burnt it by the brook Kidron." So God willing, tomorrow we're going to actually walk up the valley of the Kidron. We're going to actually see where not only did Asa burn these idols, but later on Josiah did, remember? So it was a place for getting rid of them, because of course down the bottom of the Kidron and around the valley of Hinnom was the rubbish dump of Israel. It's an appropriate place to be putting this rubbish. So this is what he does. So here is his grandmother, the favourite wife of Rehoboam, 2 Chronicles 11:21. Says he removed her from being queen. That's an interesting word. It's Hagabirah. She was a bit of a hag, by the way, this woman. Hagabirah. It means the principal lady or the mistress. In other words, she is top dog in the female echelon of Judah. Nobody has any more power than this woman. And she was actually probably ruling the nation in many ways. She was still active in government, for Rehoboam had only been dead for about 3 years at the time of Asa's accession. Clearly, very, very prominent woman. As I said in our first study today, to remove her was an act of great courage by Asa. Blood wasn't thicker than water with this man. So it says, because she had made an idol in a grove. Now the word grove here is Asherah. Asherah actually means happy. Goddess is the word, she was the goddess of fortune and happiness. So if you worshipped Asherah, you were doing so because you wanted happiness, and of course it had the sexual side of it as well. The word idol is a miflet seth, a cause of terror. So there's a very interesting translation by Rotherham. And the word, by the way, is used in the verb form in Job 9 verse 6, signifying an earthquake. So, this is no small thing. Rotherham translates it, I think, very, very well. He says, she had made a monstrous thing to the sacred stem. Now, I'm not going to go into the vivid description of the shape of these things because that would be descending into the gutter, and I'm not going to do that. So I'll let your imaginations do the work there. What he destroyed was something that is equivalent to what this world is happy to display on the internet and other places. So that will be enough. Okay, and it says Asa destroyed her idol and burnt it by the brook Kidron. And that word destroyed is kareth. Kareth means to cut off. He cut it off. He consumed it. And the lower Kidron, as I said, was near the rubbish dump of Jerusalem, the area near the valley of the son of Hinnom, which we'll see tomorrow when we wander down that valley. And we'll talk about the awful things that happened down there. So we come to verse 5. We're coming back to 2 Chronicles, we're still in, 2 Chronicles 14 and verse 5. So come back to 2 Chronicles 14 and verse 5, and it says, right at the end of the verse, and the kingdom was quiet before him. And this word quiet is shakat, it means to repose. It's a reference to the 10 years of peace mentioned in verse 1. Okay, so the kingdom was quiet, and peace was granted by Yahweh as a reward for his righteousness in cleansing the land of idolatry, as verse 6 told us. Okay? Wonderful beginning. Now you think this is a Great Reformation? No. This is the start. The Great Reformation actually occurs in chapter 15, after his conquest over Zerah the Ethiopian. So this is a pretty good start, isn't it? Cleaning out the cupboard of all of the skeletons that were in the closet. in his own family as well. Then it says in verse 6, he built fenced cities in Judah, for the land had rest. So what do you do when you get peace? Do you sit and kind of put your feet up and enjoy it? Think, well, I'm deserving of this rest? No, not this man. When God gave him peace, he didn't have to worry about contending with enemies. He used every single moment of it to get into the process of reformation. All right? He wasn't going to waste any opportunities. And I'll show you this from the record here. This is a remarkable little demonstration of this when we get to verse 7. Yahweh had given him rest, it says in verse 6. He recognised where the blessing had come from, and he didn't waste his opportunities. You know, there's a principle that Paul actually deals with in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 1 and 2. And what he says there, he says, this is the day of opportunity. All right? It's called the acceptable time. This language, it comes from Isaiah, 61. This is the acceptable time. Now, what do you understand by this being the acceptable time? Because we're actually in it right now. Well, it doesn't really mean the acceptable time. It means a time when you can have acceptance from God, okay? That's what it means. This is the time when you do the things that God will look upon and say, well, I accept that person. This is their time of opportunity. So this is what he did in that time of acceptance. Got stuck into the work. Then we come to verse 7 of 2 Chronicles 14. Therefore he said unto Judah, let us build these cities. So, as I said, this is the opportunity to build, to prepare defences against an inevitable attack. One thing we can be sure of, there will always be an inevitable attack on the truth. We're not going to have permanent peace, right? And our history shows that. We have periods where it's relatively quiet, then all of a sudden, kaboom, it blows up in your face. And why is that? Well, that's necessary. See, it's necessary as part of the process. It says of Moab in Jeremiah 48 that Moab's problem was that they weren't shifted like wine, they weren't shifted from bottle to bottle. Right? Now, what you do with wine is, and when it's going through the process, okay, is that you got all this stuff that, the sediment that goes to the bottom. Now, if you just leave it like that, it spoils the wine. What you have to do is to transfer it from one container to another. All right? So you have to have trouble. You have to have some kind of things going on in your life in order to develop and to grow. So he understood that. The peace was not going to last. There would come trouble. So what do? You get in there and prepare for it. So when it does come, you're ready for it. That was the approach of King Asa. Now look at what it says in verse 7. This is the phrase I was talking about. I love this because the Spirit is actually telling us the real character of the man. We don't always get a full speech. We get what the Spirit wants to tell us about a speech. What we get here is this man's drive, his conviction, his belief. Look what he says here in verse 7. Well, I'm going to read it from, let's read it from the words, let us. Let us build these cities and make about them walls and towers. So you've got defences for the ecclesia. Gates and bars, while the land is yet before us. The enemy hasn't come in yet, so let's prepare, because the enemy will come in. And then he says this, because we have sought Yahweh our God. Now, you could finish there, couldn't you? But it doesn't. So he says next, we have sought him. So get a picture of this man. He's standing before his people and he's appealing them, saying, let's build the defences before the enemy comes in. Why? Well, because we have sought Yahweh. We have sought him, haven't we? See the appeal in that? This man is showing the kind of leadership that is so necessary in ecclesial life, right? He's showing the kind of spirit you have to have. It's a building spirit, but it's got enthusiasm about it and a conviction that God's behind this, right? And that's what he's showing here. And he says, and he hath given us rest on every side. So what was the outcome of that? Well, so they built and prospered. And the word prospered in the Hebrew means to push forward. And if they can do it, so can we. And that's the lesson we learn from King Asa. So we come then to verse 8. Now this is the last verse before the invasion by Zerah the Ethiopian. So what are they going to do, do you think, in verse 8? And Asa had an army of men that bare targets. Right, an army. Now, it's very important, of course, to prepare for warfare. But as we learnt when we read verse 11 a little earlier, Asa didn't depend on numbers. It wasn't a numbers game with him. It was about leaning on Yahweh. And all these were mighty men of valour, says the record. Now, we know what this really means. If you elevate this from the physical to the spiritual, we know what this means, because in Jeremiah 9 and verse 3, Jeremiah makes the statement, after he searched all through Jerusalem, he makes the statement that there were none who were valiant for the truth. All right, Jeremiah 9 verse 3, there were none that were valiant for the truth. So to be mighty men of valour in the spiritual sense is to be a man of valour, a man or a woman of valour in the truth, to do the things that will bring about results for Yahweh. And we read of the number of his army here, at the end of verse 8, he had an army of, let's just read it, 300,000 out of Judah, and out of Benjamin that bare shields and drew bows, 280,000. All these were mighty men of valour. Now, that's a total, of course, of 580,000. As you can see on the screen, this is a massive increase. Rehoboam had an army of 180,000. He was told to take them back home. Of course, he wanted to try and take the kingdom back from Jeroboam. He was sent back home by Shemaiah the prophet. Abijah, you see, because of all these people that left the north and came down, Abijah could raise an army of 400,000 against Jeroboam's 800,000. Asa ends up with 580,000, and his son Jehoshaphat doubles it to 1,160,000 fighting men. Massive army that did nothing. Right? They were ready, prepared for the war. We'll come to this. Ready, prepared for the war, and never fought it. Okay, so it was a disaster. But here we've got Asa preparing his people. Now, targets there is a reference to shields. And of course, the shield of faith is a vital part of the defence of any spiritual warrior, as we're told in Ephesians 6 and verse 16. You don't have a shield of faith, you're in serious trouble. Asa had a shield of faith, and so did his men. And that's why when the attack comes, they are ready for it. They were ready for what came. So we come to Zerah the Ethiopian and his invasion in verse 9 of 2 Chronicles 14. Zerah, and this is very important meaning, his name means a rising of light. All right, Zerah, a rising of light. It's a misnomer, of course, because Zerah stands as a type of the world, the enemy of the ecclesia. But I think this has a latter day application for us, because we are being attacked today. Our brotherhood is being attacked by what you could call the rising of light, and it comes with the name of humanism. All right, it's in the guise of light. We have people that I'm associated with in my home ecclesia who think there are good things in humanism. Okay, well, what's wrong with being, looking after people, not having discrimination? What's wrong with fraternity? And see, so we're losing the battle. We are losing the battle, and this is a lesson for us today. So what about this man, the Ethiopian, this rising of light? He's called the Ethiopian. Now we know about Ethiopians. In Jeremiah 13 verse 23, they don't change their skin, do they? They don't change their skin. In other words, they come as men and they stay men, right? There's no changing in these people. And they're enemies of the truth. We know are often clothed in light. You know the reference in 2 Corinthians 11? Let's have a look at it. 2 Corinthians 11 verses 13 to 15. When Paul was writing to the Corinthians, he had a problem to address in their meeting. And there was a particular individual who was doing everything in his power to undermine Paul's influence in the Corinthian ecclesia. And this individual was always talking, loftily talking, like Judaizers used to do. And we read about him in verses 13 to 15 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And this is what it says. For of such, he says, are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. He's making a reference to a single individual in Corinth. He's transformed, he says, into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers, that is those who support him in the ecclesia, also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. So they were doomed. All right, if they remained in that state, they were doomed. But they're described as the ministers of the angels of light. You know, that's how flesh presents itself, doesn't it? And that's how this world is presenting humanism. You know, it's talking about, you know, all the good that can be done for men and giving all these men liberty and freedom and so on. And it sounds good, doesn't it, to the shallow mind, right? But we know what it really means. It means don't worry about God's principles. Leave him out of the picture. Just put man up front. So man is put at the head of the priorities list, and God is somewhere shuffled down the back end, right? He doesn't get a look in. That's humanism. So it's got the guise of light, but it's of course very, very evil. So what about this army? We come back to 2 Chronicles chapter 14. He has a large host, doesn't he? It says he came with a host of 1,000, a million men, 300 chariots, and came unto Mareshah. Right now, Mareshah is a place that is very interesting, as we know. It actually means a summit, or the chief place, 20 miles or whatever that is, 32 kilometres southwest of Jerusalem. And we read in verse 10 of the valley of Zephathah. Then Asa went out against him, so he takes his 580,000 men down to Mareshah, and they set the battle in array in the valley of Zephathah at Mareshah. Now, Zephathah means the watchtower. And of course, I think we can understand, because if you've seen where Mareshah is, you can understand that it is a watchtower, isn't it? Looking down upon the plain. That is what he does. He looks down upon this massive army, and just around, of course, to the right where we're standing, we see that great valley. But he's, of course, outnumbered 2-1. And verse 11 says, and Asa, recognising this problem, he cried unto Yahweh his God and said, Yahweh, it is nothing with thee to help, whether with many or with them that have no power. Help us, O Yahweh our God, for we rest on thee, and in thy name we go against this multitude, O Yahweh, thou art our God. Let not man prevail against thee. So let's analyse this prayer. Before he enters into battle, he sets out the facts. He states his absolute confidence in the power of God to save with many or few. There was no confidence in his own strength, though perhaps he had reason to be confident in it. He knew all his preparations would be useless without God's help. We rest on thee. Now this, I have to emphasise when we get to this word, as we said in our first study, this is probably the most important word in the study of the life of King Asa, because it occurs again 3 more times in the record of his life. And they're all in chapter 16, the chapter of his failure. Okay, and we'll come to that a little later on in our next session, or next couple of sessions. We'll deal with that matter. This word rest that you see there is shayan in the Hebrew. It means to support oneself, hence to lean upon. And that's how Rotherham translates it. On thee do we lean. We're going to find that this is the word, and you just cast your eyes across your page if it's like my Bible. But in chapter 16 and at verses 7 and 8, 3 more occurrences. And you might want to highlight these, because when we come to them, you'll see why they're there. They're there because of what is stated in chapter 14 and verse 11. So let's read verse 7 and 8 of chapter 16, which we'll come to in due course. At that time Hananiah the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said unto him, because thou hast relied, same word. It's rendered rest in chapter 14 verse 11, but it's translated relied here in chapter 16 and verse 7. Because thou hast relied on the king of Syria and not relied, there's our word again, shayan, on Yahweh thy God, therefore the host of the king of Syria has escaped. And we'll come to that later on. Verse 8, he reminds Asa, were not the Ethiopians and the Lubims, the Libyans, a huge host with very many chariots and horsemen, yet because thou didst rely, there's our word. So 4 times in this record, you got the use of this word, okay? 2 Chronicles 16 verse 7 twice, and once again in verse 8. And the principle here is 2 Chronicles 13 verse 18. You get the idea. Go back to chapter 13 and verse 18 and we read, "Thus the children of Israel were brought under at that time, and the children of Judah prevailed because they relied," here's our word, "they relied upon Yahweh God of their fathers." So if you lean on God in absolute faith and conviction, He's not likely to let you down. All right? You got that kind of faith. Even with Abijah, who was hypocritical, all right, God was on his side because Jeroboam was the other king involved and he wasn't going to be on his side. Okay? So you lean on God, then He will not fail you. So here is a lesson in how to wage successful warfare in the truth, even against great odds. Asa's example was to prepare diligently by using every opportunity provided. But in the crisis, he committed himself absolutely into the hands of Yahweh, not trusting in the arm of flesh. So what's this word that we met here in verse 11, at the end of verse 11? "Let not man prevail against thee." So in thy name we go against this multitude. Echoes, of course, David going out against Goliath, and we did a bit of that today. "Let not man prevail against thee." This is the word Enosh. Now, as you're probably fully aware, there are several Hebrew words that are rendered by the one single English word man in the King James Version. So you really have to look them up. You come across the word man, you've got no idea, unless the context helps you, as to what that really is. This word is Enosh. It means mortal, from the root to be frail. And Rotherham invariably translates it weak man, okay, just to give the meaning of the word. It's about weak man. So his appeal to Yahweh is, let not weak mortal man prevail against thee. It's unlikely, is it, that God's going to let that happen? So the outcome of this conflict was pretty obvious. The 1 million men weren't going to be an obstacle at the end of the day because of the faith of King Asa. So that's why the record then says in verse 12 of 2 Chronicles 14, "So Yahweh smote the Ethiopians before Asa." Notice this. He smote the Ethiopians, but it says before Asa. That's significant. Asa is specifically mentioned here. He was the real force behind Judah's spiritual revival. It was his faith that shone through on this day. So the divine response came immediately. He's bountiful, of course, our God, and consistent. And he often proved himself to be so in the days of the kings. You know, there's that statement by James in James chapter 5 and verse 16, that the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. It proved to be true here in this case, didn't it? This effectual, fervent prayer of Asa brought those sorts of results. And then it says in verse 13, "And Asa and the people that were with him pursued them unto Zerah." Now, why Zerah, do you think? Well, Zerah was 72 kilometres, 45 miles for the Americans, southwest of Jerusalem, on the border with Egypt. It marked the border in that time with Egypt. So was he going to pursue the remnant of the Libyans and Ethiopians into Egypt? Or was he satisfied with just clearing them out of the ecclesia? Right? He didn't go beyond the border of Judah. There's a principle here. When the world enters our ecclesias, and it is, all right, it is coming into our ecclesia, no question about that, in the form of humanism particularly, and Christ said it would, so we know it's there, okay? When we chase it out, we're going to chase it right out to, into the world? No. We get it out of the ecclesia. That's the main thing. Get it out of the ecclesia. So when they come to the border with Egypt, they stop. That's enough. Get it out of our ecclesia. So they're happy with that. Okay? So I think that's a very important principle. Then it says that Yahweh destroyed them. They were destroyed before Yahweh. Now this word destroyed actually means to burst. It's like a balloon. You've got this massive army and it's like a prick it and poof, it blows up. It burst because there were the angels of God involved in this conflict. And then we read the outcome of that. At the end of verse 13, however, it makes this point, that they carried away very much spoil. Now this is going to be very important. And they smote all the cities round about Zerah, for the fear of Yahweh came upon them. And they spoiled all the cities, for there was exceeding much spoil in them. So notice the emphasis here on the spoil that they gather. I think this is going to be the critical point that sets out the pattern of Asa's life. So he consolidated his victory by taking the border towns around Zerah, while the fear of God held those places, those towns in awe. So God had helped him. He helped him in cooperating with human faithfulness and activity, and he always will. And then it says this in verse 15. They smote also the tents of cattle. As I said, cattle is a generic term. And if you just cast your eye across to chapter 15, verse 11, it tells us that they had brought 700 oxen and 7,000 sheep. So there was a lot of oxen taken in this war as spoil. They're not mentioned. They're not mentioned in chapter 14. I wonder why. Why have we got just the two creatures mentioned here? Well, the two animals that are singled out for special mention at the end of chapter 14 aptly portray the two phases of Asa's life. So what were they? Well, a sheep, a lot of sheep. We saw it in verse 11 of chapter 15. There's 7,000 sheep. The submissiveness and meekness of the sheep was plainly seen in Asa's first 15 years, culminating in his great reformation, which we'll consider tomorrow, God willing. But sadly, the complacency and self-reliance of the camel was finally to be manifested in him. The camel was unclean under the law of Moses because of its feet. It was not cloven-hoofed. You will recall, of course, there were two critical things with animals. You had to chew the cud, and you had to have a cloven hoof. And that, what God was teaching in by the selection of those animals, you couldn't sacrifice any other animal. You had to chew the cud, and it had to have a cloven hoof. Chewing the cud, of course, is obvious, isn't it? This is ruminating upon the word of God, So you're churning over, like a cow, got a second stomach, brings up and it churns over the grass it's eaten during the day. That is what we do. We ingest the word of God. We don't just leave it there, do we? We actually think about it, like David. We churn it over in our minds. So that's ruminating. That's chewing the cud. But if that doesn't culminate in a sure and certain walk, that is what cloven hoof is about, Cloven hoof enabled animals to walk over all sorts of rocks, and the goats climb up cliff faces, very sure-footed. It has to culminate in a walk, a sure-footed walk. So chewing the cud, ruminating upon the word, has outcomes, or should have outcomes. So if you don't have a cloven hoof, then it's not working in your life, You're unclean. God doesn't want you, You've got a cloven hoof like the pig, but you don't chew the cud. You're a Judaizer. He doesn't want you either. That's the lesson that comes out of that. So we've got these two animals, the sheep and the camel. Asa was to die with diseased feet, from which he was not cured. His walk was corrupted. It was a mark of his self-reliance and his stubbornness in the face of divine admonitions. So we'll come to that in due time when we get to chapter 16, verse 12, God willing. It makes that point very, very plain. So I want to finish this session here by having a look at these two phases of Asa's life in 2 Chronicles 14 and verse 15. These sheep and these camels. So what do sheep do? Well, they hearken to the shepherd's voice, as Asa did to Yahweh's prophet, chapter 15 and verse 8. Just have a look at chapter 15, verse 8. And when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Oded the prophet, he took courage, and he put away the abominable idols out of all of the land of Judah and Benjamin, out of the cities which he had taken from Mount Ephraim. And he renewed the altar of Yahweh that was before the porch of Yahweh. So you see, he actually did something about it. He obeyed the shepherd's voice. But what about the camel, on the other hand? The camel, of course, obviously you've seen pictures of camels. You've probably ridden one. We rode them in 2007 and 15 in the Sinai desert. And they are an unusual creature. I mean, it's the way they look, the look on their face. It's sort of like complacency. You know, they've got that drop dead look, haven't they? And that's a camel. So they're notoriously self-willed and give the appearance of disinterest in receiving commands. So this is the opposite. This is the antithesis of the sheep, isn't it? The two distinct phases of this man's life. Sheep depend on the shepherd to lead them to still waters and green pastures, just like Asa did in his early years. But you see, in his latter years, he became self-reliant. The camel can go a week without water. It can lose up to 1/3 of its body weight in water. If a man loses an eighth, he dies. But a camel can lose up to 1/3 of its body weight in water. I mean, we're 75% water anyway, aren't we? Our body's 75% water. The sheep is submissive and trusting, as Asa was. We rest on thee, all right? There's the sheep-like attitude that we saw. What about a camel? He was complacent and self-reliant as Asa became in his final years. The sheep was a clean animal under the law, offered in sacrifice. It represented Asa in the first half of his reign, whereas camels were unclean under the law because they chewed the cud, but they were not cloven hoofed. They had unclean feet like Asa at the end. So that's chapter 14 of 2 Chronicles. And tomorrow, God willing, when we come to chapters 15 and 16, we're going to see some remarkable things. We're going to see chapter 15, the greatest, and I'll make this statement, I can defend it. I don't normally make statements I can't defend. The greatest reformation in Judah's history, all right, greater than Hezekiah's. I'll show you why, okay? So here was the greatest reformation in their history. Yet the very next chapter, 20 years later, this man fails and dies an abysmal failure because of his lack of faith in God. How does that happen? How do we get there? Well, because of the problem of human nature. And you know what happened? The second round of peace that he was given was not marked by activity. It's not marked by diligent activity. And that is the key. You've got to remain active. What's the principle? Romans 12:21. It's the principle. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And if we take that lesson alone away about the life of Asa, it can be important to us in the future. So God willing, tomorrow we'll have a look at his second reformation, the greatest in Judah's history, and then follow up with the sadness of his failure.